Hello and welcome everyone to Influential Minds, an EEI International Conversation series. My name is Alekia Malavarpu and I'm a Senior Analyst for International Programs at EEI. Influential Minds is our virtual conversation series which aims to discuss ideas that move the needle towards a more sustainable future with thought leaders from across the globe. Today, EEI International Programs is excited to welcome Julio Ottino, an artist, researcher, author, and dean of the McCormick School of Engineering and Applied Science at Northwestern University. He joins us today to discuss his latest book, The Nexus, Augmented Thinking for a Complex World, the New Convergence of Art, Technology, and Science, where he will dive into new modes of thinking to expand our creativity and augment our insight. He will be joined in conversation by our host, EEI Vice President of International Programs, Dr. Lawrence Jones. Throughout the session, please feel free to ask questions using the chat feature. Dr. Jones will aim to incorporate as many of them as possible into the conversation. Without further ado, I will turn this over to Lawrence to get started.
Thank you, Alekia, and good morning, Julio. Welcome to the EEI's Influential Minds.
Delighted to be with you.
Let me first of all congratulate you for the very, very well-written book, The Nexus, Augmented Thinking for a Complex World. We indeed live in a complex world, and I think what you're trying to do in this book is very fascinating in terms of the convergence of art, technology, and science. But I think let's begin, first of all, by talking about why you wrote this book.
Wow, I think the short answer was the time had come to do it, but it had a long inception. I mean, I had been collecting materials for a book like this for a long time. And I saw there were a few times where I saw things converging in such a way that gave me a glimpse that this was a good idea. Just to give you one example, I can give you two or three that are very similar. I was a senior advisor for Unilever, the company, Dutch Anglo company, for like 12 years. And when they gave me the title of senior advisor, they said, we want you to be a provocateur. We want you to look at what we're doing, question what we're doing. So I had access to the research, technology, also the knowledge management that was discussed. I had access to the management, science, research. And at one point, I convinced them that we should do something in complexity. We should organize a symposium in complexity because the thinking in complexity was going to affect lots of the things that Unilever was doing, from research to management. And yeah, we put something together. We invited lots of people. There was a senior editor from Nature. I think there was a Nobel Prize from chemistry that got invited. But what I did not know is the venue that Unilever picked to do the event. They got the Tate Modern in London, and they got a room. The Tate Modern is enormous, a room that was overlooking the Millennium Bridge and the Globe Theatre. And at that moment, I could say, I could see the intersections between art, technology, and science. Since then, I have had several like this. I did an event for Accenture where they actually rented all the modern wing of the Art Institute in Chicago. And I was the only talk, it was a talk for the top 40 partners, people who are managing either a sector or a country. And again, I have been doing this. And throughout all of this, since 2006, when I saw a show that Bruce Mau had put in Chicago, that took over the entire Museum of Contemporary Art, we had been having coffees for 12 years, discussing ideas. Actually, the central idea that I was discussing is what ended up being chapter 4 in the book, the comparisons between art, technology, and science, the structures. And then the pandemic hit us, and I had time to assemble the notes, put them together, and that was when the time came to kind of say, yeah, we'll do a book. I contacted MIT Press, and then I brought Bruce again, and that's how that happened. I mean, it was not a sudden thing. It had been brewing for, you could say, the entire life, my entire life.
Interesting. Well, look, it's fascinating how you talk about the nexus and you bring art, technology, and science together in a way that I have not seen done before. So talk a little bit about this divergence that has occurred. Now we see today art, technology, and science are almost seen as opposites. They don't come together. But in the book, you talk about the divergence. Just briefly, when did art, technology, and science diverge in history? And are we seeing a convergence occurring today?
Yeah, so the convergence today is that now more than at any point in the past, artists, and it's a very broad, diverse group, okay? I mean, first of all, artists now, even the ones who are trained in places like the Art Institute here in the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, Yale, if they need to learn something, they will learn it. I have seen that in courses that we have done with people from engineering. If they need to learn how to code, they will learn it, okay? So you could go back to the point in which art, technology, and science were together, and you can talk about Leon Battista Alberti and Alberti and Leonardo, and so the Renaissance. There was no difference. The word science had not been invented. Art, technology, and science, they were all together. Eventually, the things started to separate when people who are managing states, principalities, they saw the value that some things in math and pre-technology were useful to them. Ballistic trajectories, divert the course of rivers. Leonardo was doing a little bit of this, okay?
Leonardo da Vinci.
Well, yeah, da Vinci. So, but there were people like Niccolo Tartaglia, for example, in Italy, who wrote a book on ballistics. And there was money that they were putting on this pre-technology kind of thing. The word technology was invented 1900 kind of. And at that point, art and philosophy sort of started going one way, and technology, supported a lot by military needs, started diverging. And then there was another divergence, and it was like in many books, especially math, figures started vanishing from the books. In fact, there was a famous book I mentioned in my own book by a fellow named Lagrange,
Yes.
who boasted that you shall find no pictures in this book, because pictures were supposed to be crutches that you use, but then the real argument was independent of them. You'll remove them. So that lasted for a long, long while. But now I think it's an opportunity of bringing things more together, because artists are more entrepreneurial than ever before. I mean, there are groups that are massively large now in art, in modern art, and they will use whatever technology is out there to their needs. I mean, we can get into long discussion about AI and art now, but artists are more entrepreneurial, so the opportunity of connecting with them is as good as it has ever been.
Yeah. So the title of the book is Augmented Thinking. That's one of the sort of the sub themes. And talk about, for the audience who's listening, what do you mean by Nexus Thinking, and how does one become a Nexus thinker?
Yeah. So we get educated and we go through life equipping our brains with a library of knowledge. And the library that you acquire if you become a scientist has different volumes, not completely different, but there's some overlap that if you become an engineer or you become a lawyer, for example, you have a mental library. And that mental library is the one that provides you a lens to see the world. And is what provides the first draft of ideas that you may have to solve problems in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
There is no question that, to quote Linus Pauling in here, he said, the best way to have a good idea is to have lots of ideas, okay? Lots of different ideas. So if you have a mental library that is, let's say, coming from science, all your ideas will emerge. I mean, this can be a very diverse set, but they will be there, will be different than the library that an artist will have looking at the same issue. And the question is, could you train yourself to have an augmented mental space that somehow incorporates those two domains? It doesn't mean that if you are a scientist, you become an artist or vice versa. But if you could sort of make an effort to understand how the other domains think, then your brain will become expanded, really, and metaphorically speaking. And it has to do with, first, avoiding misconceptions that one side has about the other one. People in science, they tend to think, I'm speaking kind of in stereotypes in here, that artists create, they do things when there are moments of inspirations, and artists will tend to think that science is all rational and logical, and they don't see the passions that drive people. So, and moreover, we tend to equate the domains with the outputs that they produce, okay? An architect will equate it with a final building, or a sculpture with a big sculpture, Anish Kapoor with things that he has done, for example. And scientists, we equate them with whatever product emerge, a vaccine or something. But it's more important to understand the process that led to those things. How is that they thought? How is that they came up with ideas, they discarded them, they modified them? It's not like it's always forward. You have setbacks, how do you handle? So I think understanding how others think is critical. Now, I think the book, I try to make a case, and again, we are speaking in general terms in here, that technology, by whatever measure you pick, borrows a little bit from science and a little bit from art.
Yes.
It's both. It's not as codified as science, and it's not as free as art, but it borrows elements of both. And the more you sort of try to understand how others think, the better it will be.
So it's all about extracting the thought process from the art world, from the technology world, from the science world, and bringing it together. So
well put. It's exactly that. Yeah.
So what most people don't know, Julio, is that you are I would call it an acclaimed artist. You've done fabulous paintings. You sent me some of them. I looked at them, and it was, if I looked at the painting, didn't know you were a professor, I would think you're an artist. And when I read the book and didn't see the painting, I would think you're a professor. Talk about yourself, your experience, your journey into becoming a Nexus Thinking. When did that trigger? When did you get that inspiration to say, you know what, I'm going to practice what I preach. I myself am going to be a Nexus Thinking. When did Nexus Thinker When did that happen in your life?
In retrospective, I mean, everything looks clear in hindsight, okay?
Yes.
But there were times in which I was able to put the two things together. For example, I wrote a monograph that sort of what made my career in science, in which is a lot about math, but this book needed pictures that need to be drawn by hand. And I drew almost every picture in the book. It's a math book. But
Wow.
okay, so, but I was lucky. My father was someone who did lab work. He had a laboratory with microscopes. He was very much into histology, staining samples. So I grew up surrounded by something like that and microscopes. And my mother was a classically trained, someone classically trained in art. She never really had an independent career as an artist, but I remember looking at her work and all the things that she had done. And so I had those two things. But I grew up in Argentina, and Argentina was a little bit like many countries. Maybe think of India, where doctor, engineer. I'm exaggerating it here, okay? But it's not like you have 50 possibilities. You have broad tracks. So at some point, I had to decide. I was painting. Painting, in some sense, helped me a lot, because growing up, Argentina had a compulsory military service, and only a few people, a very, very small number, if you finish a degree, like engineering, medicine, economics, law, you could go through training and you became an officer. And I did that, 2 years in the Navy. But while I was there was one of these periodic revolutions in Argentina. The government was overthrown. I was in the middle of this. It was a very difficult time. People were vanishing right and left. But I managed to have a solo show at that point. And so instead of drifting to politics, like many people in the university, all my sort of what served as cathartic sort of thinking went into art.
The art. Mm-hmm.
And immediately after finishing that is when we got married. My wife had just finished high school. And we came to the US. Mm. And I got immersed into my PhD. The art was always there. I kept painting, but I was not connecting directly into my work, even though what I did in research, I was helped a lot by being really visual. I started working on chaos theory, and having visual imagination was of incredible help on that. That's why I ended up drawing those pictures in the book. So you always have it. And in retrospective, you say, yeah, it was clear at that moment that I had all the elements, but sometimes putting it all together, like in this book, as I said, I was one of the ones who benefited from the lockdown. I don't know, 5 or 6 successive weekends with nothing to do. Well, nothing to do, it would be an exaggeration. I had my work as a dean, but I was traveling much less. Yeah. So I was able to give some structure to the ideas, and that's how the book emerged.
So it's interesting. So obviously your childhood growing up in Argentina, your mother, your father had a big inspiration on how your career emerged and your focus on art and technology and science for that matter. Just before we get into some of the complex issues facing the world and how Nexus Thinking can help, for those listening, how can they become Nexus Thinker? By the way, can anybody become a Nexus Thinker, or do you have to have a certain set of basic skills to go down that path, or can we all become Nexus Thinkers?
I think in some sense you can, but you have to have something that you have to force yourself to train yourself. And I think I can teach people how to be creative. I can tell you how is that you should think, or some things that you should have kind of in front of your glasses that I think what you need the most is being curious. Is try to understand how people who do things do what they do. And it's not essential that you learn at some point. For example, I heard a talk recently from someone who I admire about calculus, okay, and how calculus, mathematics made the world that we live now. In order to admire calculus, you probably don't have to learn calculus, but know a little bit about how is that the ideas underlining the main concepts came into being and what the implications are. So if you are someone in science or technology, I don't think that you need to kind of learn how to paint or sculpt, but having some degree of awareness or connecting with people, maybe new friends who do that kind of thing, understanding what the drivers are, how do they pick what they want to do? Because as an artist, you could pick anything, okay? And understanding that component is essential. And the same thing will go for people in art. If you want to connect with someone who does science, you should try to kind of get deeper into what drives them, what are the ambitions that they have. Because, yeah, from the outside, science could look like something that is really cold. Sort of, you have a methodology. People who know just a bit about science will think about, well, is the scientific method. No, it's science more than anything else. Is a habit about problems to pick. You need intuition. Okay, that's how you pick things.
So, I want to get into, the other thing about the book talks about living in a complex world. There are a lot of complex global challenges facing the world. I just want to spend a few minutes talking about, from your perspective, how can Nexus Thinking be applied in 3 environments? One, in business, and then in government, because a lot of the things affecting the world today requires policymakers and government leaders to make decisions. And then also on a personal level in communities. So let's talk a little bit about, from your view, if a business leader is reading this book, how can they apply Nexus Thinking in their business? And the same for a policymaker or a politician, and then also for a community leader. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so
in the book to those three areas.
Yeah, so let's start by asserting that if you have a mental space that is augmented, has components of science and art, in some instances, what will happen is that the ideas that will emerge on how to tackle something will be diametrically opposed. They will be in conflict with each other. And the consequence of this is that you have to be mentally prepared to resolve conflicts is what I call complementarity, borrowing the term from quantum mechanics. The ability to resolve conflicts, ideas that you have to find a resolution. I think that there are so many problems now, more than ever, that requires people to manage conflicting viewpoints. So that's one aspect. The other aspect, in my view, which is super important, and is probably the main idea coming from the complex systems side, is that I would say that the definition of a leader, or part of the definition of a leader, is people who provide conditions for successful emergence. And by emergence, what I mean is the property of complex systems that when there are many interacting components, what happens as a result of those interactions is much more than the sum of the parts, okay? Typical example, but this is starting probably with the most complex of them all, will be you can study neurons to death, but you will never be able to capture consciousness on how the neurons connect with each other, forming a brain. A much simpler example would be you can study a fish to death and never imagine how a whole collection of fish will assemble into a school that seems to function like a giant organism moving in the same thing with flock of birds. So the ability to handle conflicts and the ability of exploit emergence, I would say those are two central things that business leaders should capture out of this. And the fact that organization and emergence need not to be in conflict. I think you need plans, but you also need to provide conditions for those plans to give rise to more than what you are putting in the plan.
If we expand that idea of emergence, I like it because if we look at some of the global challenges facing, let's take two of them, climate change and supply chain issues facing the world today. It speaks to this interconnection or interdependency of different systems. Yeah. So from a policy-making perspective, as a policymaker, what do I need to do when I think about designing public policy to tackle, say, climate change or supply chain, or even some of the other geopolitical issues we're facing in the world today? What can world leaders learn from this concept of emergence?
I do not know if I can give you a list of bullet points, but I think what understanding complex systems prepares you is to be less surprised when things happen. For example, we live in a world that is much more interconnected now than was 40 years ago. I mean, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, the problems affecting, even with the pandemic, China would have stayed confined in there, but now transportation, supply chains of different kinds make the problem more. So connectivity is good, but there are several hidden consequences of connectivity. I mean, no one ever thought, I haven't researched this, we're not at the beginning of the internet when people thought, well, there will be a brotherhood of everybody will connect with each other, it would be so good. If everybody saw some of the consequences of this connectedness, okay? So some of the problems that we have seen with supply chains is that we focus so much on efficiency and just-in-time concepts that fragility increase. And if you had accounted for these black swan events probably you have sacrificed a little bit of efficiency in terms of more robustness. But some of the things that we see now of consequences of how the world is, all energies connected now, and we can see the consequences of in real time of what's going on in Ukraine affecting all of us, supply chains of food, energy, everything. I think you have to be prepared for those things and accounted in your thinking when you create new structures. If all the structure is driven by efficiency, in which just-in-time delivery kind of makes things great, if everything goes great, but something happens and you are in trouble, I think the thinking needs to be more on accounting for those things more than in the past. We lived through years in which everything was going great, the world is flat, everything was going, but we are seeing now the consequences of having a much more interconnected world than we had before. So it's not like there is a list of do's and don'ts that is very, very clear, but having some thinking that accounts for the consequences of how small changes can produce drastic consequences, or how you have to be prepared for emergence. Some cases you want to produce that, in some case you would like to prevent it. For example, having people who have been, I have said that in my work within, I mean, this is a much smaller system, managing a school, the training in complex systems was probably the best training anybody could have in creating new things.
Let's talk about that training in complex systems. So what you've said, I think, is a very good lesson here, is that as you're planning, whether it's in the business environment, in the government environment, in any sort of a decision-making environment, you should always think about the hidden connections. You should also keep fragility in mind and assume that things may not always go as you plan. So let's talk about the scales. You know, let me first say to the audience, if you have any questions, please type it into the chat box and we'll try to take as many as possible. Julio, let's talk about, you know, the environment for developing this sort of a nexus thinking. In the book, you talk about different environment. You talk about the Lunar Society, you talk about Bell Labs, and you talk about, you know, Black Mountain College. How does one create an environment where nexus thinking can flourish? Can you talk about that?
Well, the environment, universities are probably the best place that you could experiment with these kinds of things. Because, yeah, at the top of the organization, you have people who have jobs and titles that do not easily transform into another one. You have someone who is the chief legal counsel. You don't expect that that person will become the chief marketing officer. But below, at the level of individual groups, research groups, basically, and this is what makes a university different than other organizations. In other organizations, yeah, the jobs at the top are fixed, but so are the jobs at the bottom, okay? The people who work in the mailroom, they can progress, but they will not morph into something completely different. But in a university, by definition, groups, research groups, you are giving them a license, and I'm talking mostly about science and technology, engineering, a license to pursue whatever research they want to pursue, subject to the constraint that you have to raise the money to support that work, okay? So, and that's how innovation can happen in there. So if you are creating an organization, and at the beginning, in a startup, everybody knows how to do everything. That's by definition kind of startup have people who are generalists in the sense that they can do all the components in this small organization. But once you start growing and you need to outsource things and you need to hire someone who is an experienced CEO or something like that, if you don't plan for having some chaos at the edges, some peripheral bets that could eventually grow into become part of the central things that what you do in the organization. Because what makes you good now in any industry, any organization, is not what is going to make you great 50 years from now. Okay. Yeah. So you have to have plans that allow for the emergence of things at the periphery. Not all of them will be good bets that eventually you can bring more inside the organization. In some cases, this has gone by the name skunk works in some industries, aerospace, but you have to have that. The normal tendency of people is to have everything kind of perfectly lined up. And for a while, that will be great. But eventually, you'll pay the price for that. You need to live with some chaos at the edges.
Chaos at the edges. So we have a question from Miss Alison Naboueri from Senegal. Very interesting question. This is the person you and I were discussing earlier this morning before we started the call. And the question she's asking, I think, is an intriguing one. How can we nurture Nexus thinking in children from infancy? So you talk about Nexus thinking at the university. I think her question is even more interesting because now she's saying, how can we do it from infancy? Given where the world is today, the next generation that's going to take over and run the world, how can we infuse Nexus thinking within them so that we can have a world that is run by Nexus thinkers?
That's a difficult question because the truth is that even in the most successful societies, the ones that have the luxury of providing the best education in high schools, preparing people to go to universities, I would say that most children everywhere, they are unaware that there are differences in thought between science, technology, art. It's all one thing. And at some point in middle school, we start kind of confining this a little bit more. And then in the most advanced societies, we are preparing people to go to the best universities, and maybe you had some inclinations about theater, but you are really good in math. So we're going to really make you great in math. And you start becoming disconnected from the people who are your friends doing some theater. And the question is, by the time that you reach the university, how many people you have, and there is enough, I can tell you this, based on demand, that the bifurcation has not been complete. They have not been lobotomized, okay? They still have an inkling of putting things together. So, but if you are managing the educational system in a country, you normally have lots and lots and lots of constraints that this kind of rough explanation doesn't take into account. So the idea would be, maybe you can have a track for people that they're really good at going deep in some things. Okay, let's say science, math, but they still have this desire of thinking more broadly. They don't go just deep down. They can do the deep dive, but they have this ability to connect more horizontally.
Do you think, Julia, there's a role for parents? Because could this be something? I mean, if you take sub-Saharan Africa, for example, or Argentina, where you grew up and your parents were very instrumental in sort of giving you that environment, could it be something that we probably see, not just the educational system, but maybe society more broadly begin to embrace and celebrate more polymath, people who are thinking more broadly like yourself? Well, what do you
I think that the way that you are being brought up were not your parents take you to concerts or theater, or I mean, this is, I mean, there are things that is very hard to catch up on demand. I mean, I'm sure you know people who have had very successful careers in business, and they reach, I don't know, 65, they retire, and the whole life was based on work. And suddenly you don't become interested in literature because you have free time. You have to have had some of the building blocks there. And it has to be more than just an ambition of, I don't know, going and playing golf. There are many things that the world will offer that you can appreciate, that will enrich your mind. But you have to have had the building blocks kind of placed early in your life that would allow you to grow into those things. It's not like you can cram for a test and suddenly you'll become interested in philosophy or art. It has to be from the beginning.
Well, before I ask the next question, I just want to read a comment that was put in the chat from Peter Cummings. And basically, he's saying that it's always wonderful to hear you. Every time he hears you, it's inspiring. Basically, you're a fantastic scientist, engineer, an artist. So when I call you an artist, you're somebody who is basically justifying or validating my statement that you're a fantastic artist. So Peter is going to jump off, but he sends his regards and really didn't have a question, but just had a comment in terms of saying that your work is fantastic. We have about 3 minutes, 7-8 minutes left. Julio, I want to hit three questions. The first one, given the world in which we live today, it's a lot of polarization in different countries. We have a lot of issues from a political standpoint. And you talk about sort of thinking about how the other person sort of things about things getting into their space. How can Nexus Thinking help us address some of the polarization we see going around the world today?
I have had comments from, I mean, one of the best comments that you get about the book is people who tell you, I mean, these are people who have run companies. Wow, I never thought of thinking about myself in this way, but now that I see it in your book, I am like that, okay? That will be at the top level, okay? Let's face it, there are people who have a lens to see the world, and that lens will never change. But there's probably a middle ground there of people who, I mean, it's so easy to see the world with a single lens. But what we want in here are people who are willing to discuss, debate, sort of learn that, yeah, there are people who have a lens that is different than yours. And maybe a better solution can be achieved if you try to see it through other people's lenses. So sometimes this is obviously a metaphor, that library brain lens, but I have seen in some cases that it helps people framing ideas, because, I mean, this is obvious. We all go through life piling up information, and sometimes we don't have time. I mean, a common problem, in my view, is is leaving some space in your brain for ideas that do not exactly fit in the mental library that you have, but leave it somewhere in there as to be filed in the future, or maybe at some point you discover, well, this is not worth filing, but avoiding the problem of rapid filing. If it fits, you put it there, you become more of an accentuated version of yourself. And if it doesn't fit, you discard it. Because what that does is the lens that you have becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, and what doesn't fit just gets discarded. And I think that's the problem of people having one single viewpoint. I mean, it's so easy to see the world with one lens, okay? Everything is easy. You just have a single viewpoint.
Yeah.
What we're advocating in here is an expansion of that, but more important, I think the most important thing is not everybody can become a Nexus thinker, okay? But the point is you can think of Nexus teams, but for something to become a Nexus team, you need enough number of people who can be Nexus thinkers and connectors in such a way that the team produces the outcome that the team could produce that would be impossible if all of these people were disconnected. There are tons of examples that you can give of the importance of these Nexus teams and thinkers.
I think as you were talking, you talk about it in the book as well. When you talk about left brain, right brain, and I think what you're saying is you need a space in your brain that is neither left nor right, but is sort of that empty space where you put sort of opposing views that doesn't fit in the left or the right, but in the middle, almost like you need to split your brain into 3 parts, not into 2 parts, like we've had.
You need for some things, rapid convergence is good. For some things, rapid convergence is bad. So what you want to avoid is rapid bifurcation. Okay?
Sure.
You need to contemplate things more before you veer right or left. And sometimes having people within a team that can keep things together. I mean, there are 2 extremes that are bad. One is having lots of technical know-how and framing a question in such a way that you can solve it, but you discover that you framed the wrong question. Okay? There is no big prize for solving correctly what turns out to be the wrong problem. On the other hand, you cannot have a team that is always producing new ideas, but never converges on anything. So you need both. You need both.
Interesting. Both divergence and convergence. So just briefly, let's talk about energy, electricity. This is the Edison Electric Institute. We do a lot of work around electricity and energy. But I bring this up because in the book, you talk about Thomas Edison. And you talk about Edison and a couple of other individuals in the book who, to some extent, were not necessarily Nexus thinkers per se, but they were polymath. They were exploring different ideas. So talk about this idea of people like Thomas Edison. You talk about Galileo. You talk about all of these folks who to some extent were, I would call them semi-Nexus thinkers. But yet and still they had a big impact on the world. Can you talk a little bit about them? And then also, before I forget electricity, I'd love for you to talk about James Watt and the steam engine. So let's talk Edison first and then James Watt.
No, I mean, Edison, I think there are 2 parts to Edison, just to be very, very simplistic. One is the obsessive need to produce new things as an individual, and never giving up But the other one is basically, this is creating an organization, not one person, like Nikola Tesla, an organization that was, whole purpose was of producing new innovations. So you have the innovations, the person, and the organization, okay? In the case of Galileo, yeah, he was an amazing, Steve Hawkins credits Galileo much more than Newton about being the inventor of new physics. But Galileo also had an influence that had to do with how well he could market his ideas. He crossed the line with the church, but he was able to market the ideas and also see connections that other people didn't see. But I think the story of Galileo and the optical tubes and looking at the moon and being supported by the whole environment of Renaissance, Padua or Florence, is one perfect idea of the intersection of art, technology, and science. The case of Watt is really interesting because I don't know when I learned this. Watt, of course, is credited with the invention of the steam engine and so on and so forth, but apparently no one knew of his secret attic that he had at home, where he was trying to basically reproduce sculptures, sort of primitive versions of like 3D reconstruction of objects.
Yeah.
At some point, they discovered that he had that. They moved every object. He was also looking at crystals. They say whole connect. They moved the whole museum is moved to some place in London. I had to contact that museum to get some images from them. But he had this sort of hidden component. Probably would have been better if that component would have been more visible. But I mean, there's going to be always a role for the in-depth specialist. There's no question about it. But at given moments in time and in history, there are these people who are able to transcend the domain, sometimes even before the domain is named, that can provide these connections. And what, I mean, the most important individuals of them all are the ones that is what I call break with, not breakthroughs, because if it's something really, really, really important that you come up with, sometimes what you have to do in order to do this new thing is abandon most of the implicit thinking and assumptions associated with the prior domain. And that's what I call a break with. A break with is, and by the way, incidentally, this is one of the main problems that I see about AI generated anything. So let me give you one sort of practical example. Let's say that you're an architect and in 1970, and you are designing skyscrapers and, I don't know, hotels with big atriums and so on and so forth. And you can store every design and information about every prior building that has been done up to 1970. And I said, go, give me ideas. I don't think you'll ever come up with, I guess the name of this fellow was John Portman, who decided to put the elevators outside the building or inside the atrium, but making them visible, because that broke an assumption that no one said, well, you cannot put the elevators outside, but implicit in every design was that they were inside. So in the same way that you can store all the history of physics prior to 1900 and never ever to be able to come up with quantum mechanics, because who would have thought that energy could be discrete? Okay.
Yeah,
So the ability to come up with something that is a break with, I think is an inherently human thing. Maybe it can be at some point modeled or incorporated, but in the way that things are now in AI, is not there. You cannot come up with something new. You recreate things from the past.
I have learned something today from you that I didn't know, Julio, is the concept of break with technologies, because a lot of people talk about breakthrough technologies. And I think what you're advocating here is very interesting. Come up with break with technologies, which means you need to have break with ideas. The last 3 minutes we have, I just want to reflect on two things here. One, I'd like to get your thoughts on the idea of, prediction and choices. Towards the end of the book, you talk about taking the big picture, stepping back, and understanding the difficulty with making predictions and the choices you're going to have to make when you face critical decisions in your life. How critical is that in terms of using Nexus thinking to manage making prediction and also dealing with choices?
Yeah, I don't know if this comes directly from Nexus thinking, but let's assert that predicting something used to be completely connected with understanding something, but now you can predict things without understanding that. And again, AI is at the root of all of this. Okay, so you can predict things, and this is at the root on how AI makes decisions, and people want to open the book. You can predict things without understanding them. But I would say that, again, the choices, again, it's the issue of bifurcations in here, okay? So one example that I give in there, which is not coming from physics, is marketing being possibly driven all by data or all by intuition, okay? And that's a choice that you have to make on how you are going to balance those two things. A company like Facebook is the one that has probably the most amount of data of any company in the planet. But in terms of marketing, I think you'll agree with me that they don't have the best marketing in the planet, okay? Whereas there are companies that they will be perceived as being driven by more artsy intuition. I'm talking about maybe Louis Vuitton. Okay, they have the data-driven part more hidden, but it's a choice that you have to make in between those two balancing points. But I do not know if this answers part of what you are hinting at.
I think it gets a little bit to what I was trying to get at. We're coming to the top of the hour. Again, the book, The Nexus, The Convergence of Art, Technology, and Science, by my friend, Professor Ottino. Julia, before we end, one last question. So the book is out, and I always like when we talk to authors on the Influential Minds, they all have a new project. So two last quick questions. One, what is your next project? And then two, a year from now, if I were to talk to you, what would you hope this book would have accomplished in society?
So regarding new projects, I injected some ideas about AI and art because some people have driven me in that direction. I have to comment on that. But again, two independent people drove me to think, and in fact, I'm giving a talk Friday about Nexus and the Metaverse. So maybe in the future, there will be something tangible about connecting Nexus and the Metaverse, because the Nexus, in some sense, is about augmentation of spaces and thinking, increasing our ability to sense things. And the metaverse tries to do that. So I would like to see people who have been affected in their thinking, especially people in the positions of decision making. I share with you the note from someone comes from the world of music. Never expected someone from that space to be so taken by the ideas. But what an author hopes is that you have altered the way that some people think. And I want to see consequences of that. But the book itself can branch into so many directions, sometimes because people ask you one question and somehow in trying to answer that question, you say, wow, I wish I could have said more about that. Okay.
Yeah. Well, look, the book is fascinating. And again, I recommend this book to a lot of people out there. I must say, what makes this book easy to read are the images and the pictures. If you have an 8-hour flight from Washington to Europe, as I did on last week, you can actually finish the book. So if you plan on not sleeping on a flight, you should get a copy of this book. It will keep you captivated and alive and awake throughout the flight. So Julio, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again for the book. Congratulations. And I look forward to meeting you in a not too distant future.
Thank you, Lawrence. I very much appreciated the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.